So welcome everyone to panel 7, title of which is Russia in the Post-Cold War Era. In this session we will have 3 presenters. We will have Lucas BAAKE from the Wilson Center, an Abbey student. The title of his paper is Struggle for Recognition, Ukrainian-Russian Relations, Western Strategy and the Demise of the Soviet Union between 1990 and 1992. Following him we will have COSMAO from King's College London, also an Abbey student. The title of the paper is Building the Cult of Personality, Putin since the year 2000. And following them, we will have Amartya SHARMA online from George Washington University. The title of his paper is The New Cold War, Putinism and the Return of History. And finally, let me introduce myself. I'm Zoltán, assistant lecturer at Corvinus University of Budapest. My field of research is neo-medievalism and the European Union. So I'm looking forward to these presentations, and following them, we will collect questions at the end of the panel. Have a discussion afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you much for the introduction. So in my contribution today, I want to present a new view on the old question how and why the Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991. To this date, many different answers have been given. For example, political malaise, economic stagnation, gerontocratic leadership, nationalistic aspirations, ethnic strife, like Dina told us, environmental concerns, or the political turmoil in Eastern Europe. Although this paper does not attempt to refute these explanations, I will show that a crucial dimension has hitherto been neglected. What all the mentioned explanations have in common is that they understand the Soviet collapse as an almost exclusively internal affair, in which other countries, especially the West, only played the role of a passive bystander. But there's more to be said. A useful starting point to make this point clear is Edward Walker's claim that the Soviet Union was killed by sovereignty. For him, the end of the Soviet Union as a political entity was made possible by the strife for sovereignty of the different Soviet republics, which eventually led to the federal breakup along the legal lines. However, it is important to underline that these claims for sovereignty were contested and that the term sovereignty lacked a fixed semantic content in the Soviet legal vocabulary. From the first declarations of sovereignty in mid-1990 onwards, the meaning of sovereignty, the term sovereignty, could fluctuate from more economic or political autonomy to full-blown independence. This semantic change needed to be validated and publicly fixated, and it is here that recognition, may it be between different Soviet republics or from outside countries, comes into play. And to make this point clear, the connection between sovereignty and recognition, I want to give 2 short examples. The first example is taken from 2 meetings which the Ukrainian head of the Supreme Soviet and later President Leonid Kravchuk had with American President George Bush. And I cite, beginning of August 1991, "I also hope, Mr. President, that you will understand the aspiration of Ukraine for cooperation in different fields. We believe friendship and cooperation are very important for us." And 1 month later, "We want direct diplomatic relations with the US. We request the US to establish such relations." These 2 citations are a good example for the active lobbying for recognition by Soviet republics, which could reach from the intensification of political or economic ties to direct recognition of independence. However, also on the Western side, the recognition question played an important role. Here, the notes of US President Bush on the National Security Council meeting from early September 1991 are particularly valuable. And I cite, he describes the debate. "But what should we do now to engage Ukraine?" asked Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense. "We are reacting." Scowcroft observed that Cheney's premise was that we would be dealing with 15 or 16 independent countries. "The voluntary breakup of the Soviet Union is in our interest," argued Cheney. "If it's a voluntary association, it will happen. If democracy fails, we're better off if they're small." And then BAAKE corrected, "The peaceful breakup of the Soviet Union is in our interest. We don't want another Yugoslavia." This citation demonstrates that the question of recognition and the right form of engagement with the Soviet republics were not only contested but also considered as of great consequences. And these examples
Great.
We need this one. Yeah. That's her.
What if you turn the mouse?
The blue mouse. Okay.
Mouse?
No, it's not working either. So
Of course.
You got it. Yeah, perfect, thanks. So these examples I just mentioned, I hope you still remember, reveal two dimensions of what I call struggle for recognition. That's like the main concept of my paper. This struggle comes first in the form of the Soviet republics, which attempted to gain recognition, can you click, in order to increase their leverage against the Union center, and can second be found as a struggle on the Western side about the right approach to the recognition question. And I will argue in the following minutes that that my analysis of the struggle reveals, on the one hand, a shift from mere sovereignty, so the sovereignty understood as sovereignty in the Soviet Union, to independence from it. And second, a specific Western strategy for structuring the Soviet, respectively, or post-Soviet space. And these two claims work towards a better understanding of the Western managing of the end of the Soviet Union, which follows a similar pattern as the managing of the end of the Cold War. And I work with concepts of scholars such as Mary Soroti, Christina Spohr, or John Eikenberry, who have shown that the Cold War endgame was marked by expansions of pre-existent norms and institutions to the eastern side of the Cold War divide. And it's this dynamic which can also be observed in the Soviet collapse and provide for an explanation which links decision made in the last months of the Soviet Union to settlements of the post-Soviet space in the early 1990s. However, before presenting my argument, one caveat is necessary. The struggle for recognition unfolded not only from Tallinn to Tashkent and Washington to Warsaw, but must also be understood in the context of the implosion of Yugoslavia. However, in this presentation, I will restrict myself to the path to independence of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic and the US response on the Western side. At least the term, and now I want to expose like the first argument, so the shift from sovereignty to independence. At least the term sovereignty was not unknown in the Soviet federal setup before 1919. As early as 1922, when the Soviet Union came into existence through a formal treaty, sovereignty, including the right to secession, was granted to the republics. However, this right was never foreseen to be exercised, and sovereignty didn't gain a precise meaning in the Soviet federal setup. Nonetheless, legally, the Soviet republics were always sovereign. In this light, it might appear bizarre that the year 1990 was marked by the Parade of Sovereignties, so-called Parade of Sovereignties, the subsequent declaration of sovereignty of several Soviet republics. But why should the republics declare something which they, at least legally, already possessed? One can make sense out of this puzzle with the help of Walker's legal analysis. He showed that despite the constitutional right to sovereignty, the term sovereignty was a rather vacuous term, in the Soviet context at least. And this opened up the possibility for the republics to refer to the granted right, which was semantically ambiguous. And as such, it was the ideal vehicle for national aspirations, as in the case of Ukraine, secessionist intention, as in the case of the Baltics, or ambitious politicians, as in the case of Russia and Yeltsin, which tried to improve their position against the Union center. However, with the lack of a fixed meaning, the contested claim to sovereignty had to be established and publicly validated. And it is at this point where recognition comes into play. The declarations of sovereignty were a first way to fixate an intended understanding of sovereignty, term sovereignty. Although the content of the single declarations varied, they had in common that sovereignty was initially envisioned as an increased autonomy within, but not yet independence from the Union. And here's the example. The Ukrainian Declaration on State Sovereignty constituted one example, albeit with a comparatively radical wording. Its interpretation of sovereignty placed Ukrainian law over Union law and emphasized the independent power of the Republic. However, this interpretation of the term sovereignty had to be defended publicly against competing conceptions. For example, the media discourse in the following month was dominated by the prospects of a sovereign Ukraine and the discussion of the right degree of sovereignty. Could you please put the next? It is in this context the recurring demand for real sovereignty or proper sovereignty, as in the right example, shows that sovereignty was not seen as something given, but rather something which could be diverse and can be more or less realized. However, the meaning was not only fixated through official proclamations or public discourse, but also through external recognition. An early example is the Russian-Ukrainian Treaty of November 1990, in which the two Soviet republics explicitly recognized each other as sovereign. The value of recognition in the struggle for power in the Soviet Union was established and quickly turned from a power struggle into a struggle for recognition. It's interesting that the center, in this case Gorbachev himself, indirectly recognized these claims for sovereignty by allowing a renegotiation of the relations between center and the republics in form of a new union treaty. The Union republics, in particular Russia and Ukraine, also lobbied for indirect recognition from the West in order to gain more status against Gorbachev. And yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and this is the second step of my argument. As the struggle for supremacy between the republics and the center intensified, the struggle for recognition also began to spill over to the West. The dominating questions were the following: how should the West react? To which degree could it interact directly with the republics and therefore voluntarily or involuntarily contribute to their legitimacy? Questions of recognition centered especially on Ukraine, of which a potential independence was seen as a make or break for the future of the Union. However, apart from the work of, for example, Serhii Plokhy, this debate and its importance have previously been neglected. Either the Western decision to eventually recognize Ukraine has been considered as merely a passive reaction to a fait accompli, like, for example, Christina Spohr argued, or the debate within the European capitals was interpreted as undecisive, as Mary Soroti argued. However, I can show, and it can be shown, that the emerging debate on recognition within different countries and institutions saw the emergence of recognition as a strategic tool through which strategic visions for the post-Soviet space were meant to be realized. At first, the Bush administration was reluctant to engage with republics. In a diary entry from March 17, 1991, Bush noted, "My view is, you dance with who's on the dance floor. You don't try to influence this succession. We meet with republic leaders, but we can't overdo it." This policy was initially pursued and led some commentators to attribute to Bush a reluctant and short-sighted approach, which, until December 1991, tried to save the stability of the Union center. However, this view is too coarse-grained and doesn't do justice to subtle changes in the US position. At first, the Bush administration followed this cautious approach. For instance, in a meeting with high-ranking Ukrainian politicians in early August 1991, Kravchuk tried to convince Bush to allow the opening of a Ukrainian consulate in the US. And this is another example for a subtle attempt to gain broader recognition by increasing bilateral ties. Bush emphasized the need to deal officially and respectfully with the Union center and described the situation as a delicate balance. However, this balance was no more after the failed August coup and changed the strategic calculus on both sides of the recognition struggle. Shortly after the coup failed, with Gorbachev's authority already being in freefall, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic declared its independence, now making unambiguously clear that it didn't seek any role in a federal setup whatsoever. The US policy to deal primarily with the Union center was no longer viable. And it is in this context that a split emerged in the Bush administration on how to deal with the recognition issue of Ukraine. On the one hand, a group around Dick Cheney saw in the recognition a tool to break up the Soviet Union into several smaller states, which would pose a reduced danger for the US. On the other hand, James Baker, Secretary of State, emphasized the importance of stability, especially in light of nuclear proliferation, which could only be achieved through a strong center. Some interpretations see this debate as never fully resolved, leaving the US with no other choice than to react passively to the unfolding event. This view, however, is myopic. Although a majority of US documents is still classified, it is possible to trace the changing position through exchanges between British and American officials, and I use British Foreign Office documents in the following part. After the failed coup, the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence, as well as the announcement to hold a referendum on December 1st, and many Western states began to realize that a recognition would become inevitable in the future. For example, on October 28, the British Foreign Office noted that their American counterparts, and I cite, were looking carefully at whether they could use recognition as a leverage on Soviet republics to obtain a more constructive response on arms control and debt sharing. In mid-November, this new position was made explicit. The Undersecretary for Political Affairs said that the Americans would be in no hurry to recognize. They were determined to use the leverage that existed to the full. In particular, the Ukraine must accept its obligation under international treaties, especially START and CFE. These statements can be read as a conscious attempt to extend the set of established international norms and rules to the Soviet republics, which are about to become independent. The explicit lobbying for this extension of norms becomes from August 1991 an important part of the policy of most of the Western states. Although the final settlement of these problems, such as Ukraine's ratification of START, was only found after 1991, the policy and commitments were formulated within and through the struggle of recognition. Although Mary Soroti was partially right that the debate within the Bush administration was never fully resolved, it is easy to see here how Cheney's line, and that means using recognition as a strategic tool, was pursued. Thus, it was not the successful implementation of these strategic goals that prompted the recognition of Ukraine. The results of the December 1 referendum and the recognition of Ukraine's independence by Russia a few days later prompted the US to recognize Ukraine on December 25th. However, with this act, the US didn't abandon its strategic objectives: the denuclearization of Ukraine, its inclusion into the international law regime, and the stabilization of its relationship with Russia, although first formulated in the context of the struggle for recognition, were from now on further pursued and subsequently implemented up to the Budapest Memorandum in December 1994. Furthermore, the US position on recognition also revealed a distinct strategic vision for the balance within the post-Soviet space. In this case, the wording matters. While Ukraine was simply recognized as independent, the newborn Russian Federation was recognized as the core state. The wording was not only meant to guarantee that the Russian Federation was the legal successor of the Soviet Union, but also revealed the continued and perpetuated preference of a strong center around which the newly independent republics would be grouped. And this aspect reflects the line pursued by James Baker, who emphasized the importance of stability around a center, but warned against precipitate recognition. To conclude, I hope to have shown that the role of Western countries, especially the US, and the role of recognition play an important role for a comprehensive understanding of the Soviet demise. Although other interpretations might be better suited to explain the why, the story of the struggle for recognition proved indispensable to explain how the Soviet federal breakup unfolded. Although not decisive, the importance of external recognition for the Soviet republics in their struggle against the center, as well as the formulation of policies which would reverberate well beyond 1991 and maybe until today, make the struggle for recognition an important episode for the end of the Cold War and beyond. And I thank you very much, and I hope with my position I've opened the door from the late Soviet history to post-Soviet history, which will be the field of my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. And in case the audience has any questions, just collect them. We will ask questions at the end of the panel. And also thank you very much for keeping in mind the time frame. We can move on to the presentation by Emma COSMAO. The time frame is 15 minutes.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. My presentation title has changed ever so slightly, and there's a very specific reason for that. My research into Putin and the building of his cult of personality over the past 20 or so years was mostly broad until quite recently, and then a couple of months ago I had what can only be called a heated debate with one of my parents' friends, who started the sentence with "not to be sexist, but," which is always a great way to start a sentence, and he said, "Not to be sexist, but you can really respect the Russian generals. I mean, they really give off that strong energy. I mean, when you look at the European foreign ministers, all these women." And so I thought, okay. And I didn't have like a great way to respond, and so that's why I kind of went down a rabbit hole and I looked at Putin and the Kremlin administration generally and kind of investigated why it is that they are perceived as so masculine and if that's an intentional part of their diplomacy. So, yeah, it's been 2 decades since he came to power, and I would say one of the main things that he's been focusing on has been not only reshaping the way that he's viewed over the past 20 years, but also how Russia is viewed in the world and reshaping Russian identity after a period of quite a big identity crisis. And I would argue that this falls within a wider tradition in Russia and the Soviet Union and Imperial Russia, even some historians have argued, to have this kind of cult figurehead, this father figure at the top of the Russian administration. So, quickly going to go through the contents. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the history and the why and the how of the cult of personality in the Soviet Union and then in Russia. Then I'm going to explore the gender and the cult of personality, kind of looking at Stalin and Putin, seeing if there's any similarities and what Putin's built on, and then specifically go into the case of Putin, what distinguishes him from his predecessors as head of state, and then I'll have a couple of concluding remarks. So, here we go. So the what, the why, and the how. So the cult of personality as a term was first used actually at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party by Nikita Khrushchev. And he was talking about Stalin and Lenin specifically, and he was talking about how they had built themselves up to be these figureheads. Since then, academics have really latched onto this word, and it's been used to describe Stalin, Mao Zedong, Adolf Hitler, Napoleon Bonaparte, Caesar Augustus, and a whole host of other people. But the definition that struck me is one that Rees and Chang in separate papers and separate writing have come up with, which is that the cult of personality is the deliberate creation, projection, and propagation of the godlike image of one man. As an aside, we know that Lenin made a very big conscious effort to remove religion from the Soviet Union, and that was a very sore spot for a long time. But we see a lot of similarities between Bolshevism and religion, and specifically from the 1920s, we've got an academic called Burton Russell who traveled around the Soviet Union and noted that Russia noted that Bolshevism had a lot of similarities to Islam in his memoirs. Putin, since he's come to the front of the Kremlin, has really emphasized the role of the Orthodox Church in Russia, and he's associated himself quite strongly with the Russian patriarch, giving religion a key role in Russian society today. In 2019, we saw the splitting of the Moscow and Kiev patriarchs, which was a very significant break and a very clear example of how religion has been used politically to show political ambition. And just this week, it was the 29th of May, the Moscow-backed Ukrainian Orthodox Church, not the same as the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, very different, officially split from the Moscow Patriarch as well. So that's another 100+ churches around Ukraine that have completely distanced themselves from the Moscow Patriarch. So this is a big, big break in the narrative that Putin's been trying to spin over the past 20 years of bringing the church close to the Kremlin and to bring the Ukrainians close to the Russians. He's built his political system around one man who's promoted political stability, who's emphasized the collective and working together under one nation. The central goal being that having a cult of personality is to be a godlike figure, according to the definition that I chose. So where's the line between a cult of personality and a religion? If you push this a little further, Valerie Sterling wrote a fantastic book called Putin, Sex and Politics. I really recommend it to anyone who's interested. And she suggests in that book that the role of sex in Putinist politics is to bring on a play of traditional masculine features into politics. And this works in this system. He's appealing to Russia as this strong stabilizing force. She argued that alongside the history of building cults of personality around these leaders, there's this continuous trend of hypermasculinity and gendered ideals which are reinforcing this godlike image. Without going too deep into the relationship between organized Christian religion and the established patriarchal system we live in generally, which is a debate we can have another day, I really do want to highlight how important this has been in building Putin's approach to the cult of personality. So, in the cult of personality, or building a cult of personality and gender, I've identified kind of three main sections, which I'm going to take you through. So the first being the personal imagery which surrounds leaders. So under Stalin, under Putin, we see a propagation of very carefully created image throughout their time at the head of the state, from posters to busts and museums to their honor. I mean, the Gory Museum in Georgia is quite the honoring monument to Stalin, and I think that that is very key when you're trying to understand the perspective and the image that was built around him. The distinguishing feature between Stalin and Putin, in my opinion, and this is something which Valerie Sterling has argued as well, is that Stalin's image was built not necessarily deliberately by Stalin and by his accomplices. It was more so built in the aftermath of his rule, whereas Putin has really taken on this role and has made it a very central part of his public diplomacy, and it's very deliberate. Their rhetoric, you've got some similarities there. They bring in some traditional common ideas of gender in Russia. You've got the role of the man, the role of the woman in this. And both of them, but particularly Putin, and this is a very recent development that we've seen surrounding Ukraine, is appealing to Russian strength and success in World War II. And I'll return to this when I talk a little bit about the rhetoric about denazification of Ukraine. Another element of building the cult of personality is symbolism, which overlaps between gender and general cults of personality. The hammer and sickle, the Z symbolism, you bring that into a military aspect, and you're building this image of the strong man who's fighting for Russia under those symbols. So it's very striking to me that you've got a continuing symbolism through that. I couldn't do a presentation on Putin's cult of personality without bringing in this picture, so I hope you appreciate it. So, first of all, Putin has positioned himself as a father figure, the patriarch. He's got demonstrations of judo, fishing, horseback riding, fighting flyer jets, and all sorts of things. And this is part of his personality cult. This is a very deliberate part of his personality cult. He's appealing to those traditional values, to this renewed Orthodox sentiment in Russia, this Christian sentiment in Russia, and he's appealing to that and building on that. And he's done that also through, as I previously mentioned, building that relationship with the Orthodox Church. He also has used sex and gender in his political campaigns. I think the most striking example of that was in 2012. There was an ad that was running in Russia where you had a couple that went into a voting booth together, and they come out looking all tussled. And the tagline is, "Сделаем это вместе," let's do this together. Obviously, the implications are there. This campaign reinforced not only heteronormative ideals by having a man and a woman going into the voting booth, but it also implicates sex so directly into the democratic process in a very, very negative and hindering way. He's infused gender norms into his politics, and he's simultaneously emphasized his role as the patriarch who is taking care of Russia as a father figure. But the way that he's brought gender into his politics, into his appearance, is not only into him himself, but also in the way that he discredits his opponents, both in the political sphere and in the civic space. For example, we see this with the emasculation of Navalny and his campaign. You see representatives from the Kremlin calling the organization impotent, which I think is a very carefully chosen word. I don't think it's by accident that you're choosing this kind of language. He also has noted many times that Navalny has escaped or avoided his military service, that he doesn't want to serve the motherland. And through this, he's also implicating that this man is not strong enough. He's not going to be able to lead Russia and to protect Russia in the way that I can. We also see this more recently when Marina, I'm going to butcher this, Ovsyannikova, the journalist who was working on Russian state TV, who protested on live TV recently, the reaction to that by Russian state media has been calling her hysteric, calling her, putting and discrediting her actions both as a mother, saying that she shouldn't be a mother because she's done this, and also calling her hysteric and discrediting her very valid political views due to the fact that she's a woman. I also wanted to quickly mention Pussy Riot, who I think are an interesting case because Putin has talked about them a few times, and he has called them witches in an interview. Again, he's bringing in this relationship with religion by reminding of witches who were attacked in medieval times, these women who had maybe some medicinal abilities and who were attacked for this, potentially maybe because they had the form of power when they were in a society that was trying to give that away from them. So this brings us on to our conclusion. I've argued here that Putin has deliberately built a cult of personality based on gender ideals in order to reinforce himself as the patriarch of father figure of Russia, the strong man who will stabilize and keep the country together in an era when he started in 2000, where Russia was really trying to find a new raison d'être. I just want to leave you with a little bit of food for thought. I'm curious to hear, maybe we can have a talk about it, what a cult of personality around a woman would look like. Would it also play on religious features? Would it also intertwine the Virgin Mary? Would this theory of religion being implicated not stand at all? Thank you so much.
Thank you for this highly interesting presentation, and also for keeping in mind the time limit. Thank you very much. And I think now we can move on to the third presenter, Amartya Sharma. So I would like to ask Shimon to maybe call him now.
Don't like it.
All right, so in the meanwhile, of course, feel free to ask questions. You might have to wait for a while. Yeah, go ahead. In the middle, right? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your presentations. I would like to ask like one question for the two of you, or maybe we can just do that.
Thank you for being so flexible.
Oh, don't worry, I'm flexible.
So I would like to welcome Mr. Amartya Sharma in panel number 7 on Russia in the post-Cold War era. And I would also like to ask him to start his presentation called The New Cold War, Putinism and the Return of History. And you have 15 minutes for the presentation. Can you hear us? We cannot hear you. That is the problem, I think. Just a minute, please. In the meanwhile, I will introduce myself. I'm Zoltán, KELEMEN, assistant lecturer at Corvinus University of Budapest. And I'm moderating this panel. We can't hear you, unfortunately, but you can hear us, right? Yeah, okay, thank you. So the problem is here. Could you speak up? We still cannot hear you. Just a minute.
Itt ez valahol. Itt egy kattints a hangszín. Itt jó, oké. Akkor a kimenettel van gond. Nem, ez jó volt, ezt meg vissza.
Right, let's try it now.
Hello?
Great. Thank you. So now the floor is yours in 15 minutes.
Great, thank you so much. And I just wanted to thank you all again for allowing me to present and accommodating the virtual platform here as well. So for this presentation, I wanted to re-examine the history of the Cold War. We won the ideological battles and the hard-won victories later squandered. The first part of the essay examines the historical dynamics between President Ronald Reagan and President Mikhail Gorbachev near the end of the Cold War, and then the second part will examine the peace dividend, I argue later squandered by Western powers, and argued within the framework of Francis Fukuyama's The End of History thesis, the immutable power of liberalism and democracy, shaping the future of humanity. So some say that Ronald Reagan single-handedly brought down the Berlin Wall with one speech. That's certainly the prevailing theory here in the United States. Others will say that Premier Gorbachev was a Russian leader unlike any other, one who allowed for liberal reforms and transcended his predecessors, as Michael Mandelbaum has argued. It seems that the USSR's fate and a combination of Gorbachev's loosened grip on Eastern Europe and the revolutions led by nationalists in the Soviet bloc. Professor Joseph Nye at the Harvard School, I think, says it most eloquently. He writes that although the theory of communism aims to establish a system of class justice, the Soviet Union maintained domestic power through a brutal security apparatus involving lethal purges, gulags, broad censorship, and ubiquitous informants. The net effect of these brutal measures was a general loss of faith in their system. Slavenka Dracula, the author of How We Survived Communism, and even laughed at an acclaimed book of hers, makes a similar point, referring to her time living in an informally Yugoslavia. We were simply not ready to accept the deteriorating standard of living in the name of an ideology we didn't believe in. This is how the communists truly lost. Furthermore, William Hitchcock remarks in his struggle for Europe, it's wrong to rob the Eastern Europeans of their place in history as authors of genuine revolution. In 1989, thousands upon thousands of people in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, motivated by a simple yearning for personal freedom, pulled down the ramparts for the East European police state, end quote. This all to say that when Gorbachev was in power, there was a sort of positive feedback loop that was created such that his loosened grip and allowance for more liberal reforms created space for Eastern European countries to finally have the ability to rise up in ways that they had been for decades prior during the communist state in the USSR. For example, Gorbachev introduced the glasnost, which opened the USSR to information, consolidated government and exchange of Western ideas. He believed that adopting liberal ideas of free speech and press would calm the USSR intentions for democratic revolution and peace. However, he was confronted with the same problem that Khrushchev was faced with when he pushed for de-Stalinization as well. Both strengthened the resistance towards Soviet communism. Once glasnost let people say what they thought, many people simply said that they wanted out. Similarly, Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that pro-democratization uprisings or revolutionary movements in any state in the Soviet bloc threatened the entire USSR, justifying intervention in those states, thus substantially shrinking Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe. Regarding this abandonment, the discarding of the Brezhnev Doctrine and renounced use of force to resolve conflicts effectively will the end of the communist regimes in Europe, again, because it created that space for democratic revolution to uprise. For example, after Gorbachev legislated glasnost, he refused the Brezhnev Doctrine after Poland held free elections in 1989. That same year, the Polish United Workers' Party was defeated quite handily. Though Gorbachev intended to revive communism's popularity and creating these reforms, he opened a window for Poland to oust the previous communist, or at least to attempt to oust the previous communist hegemony. So while the glasnost intended to legislate political reforms, perestroika was political reforms, and the perestroika was an economic initiative that allowed market incentives to Soviet citizens. Another example I argue for where Gorbachev's attempts to slowly provide moderate liberal reforms. Gorbachev exclaimed that profound transformations must be carried out in the economy and a higher standard of living must be ensured. However, to invoke Joseph Nye once again, he writes that Gorbachev wanted to reform communism, not replace it, but his reforms snowballed into a revolution driven from below rather than controlled from above. In trying to repair communism, he punched a hole in the system. Like a hole in a dam, once pent-up pressure began to escape, it widened the opening and tore apart the system. So eventually Gorbachev suffered again to his unintended consequences of his reforms. Nye continues, the Soviet economy's decline reflected the diminished ability of central planning to respond to global economic change. By the late 1980s, only 80% of Soviet industry was globally competitive, and it's difficult for a country to be a superpower when the world does not want 92% of what it produces. So essentially, to summarize, this positive feedback loop again was created, and to challenge the prevailing theories here in the United States that aggressive foreign policy was the real reason that the Soviet Union fell. It was really increased tension from within, the increase in rebellions and democratic revolutions by the people and the states in the Soviet bloc that then met a leader like Gorbachev, who instead of being incredibly strict, like his predecessors, decided to de-Stalinize and decided to provide limited liberal reforms, which then only opened the window further for the Soviet Union to fall and for oppressed peoples in the Soviet bloc to rise up and replace their regime. So then to pivot to the second half here, how do we arrive at a situation where Gorbachev became a persona non grata, if you will, as a global statesman, while Putin now is in charge of rebuilding the Russian motherland? Today, almost 3 decades after the Cold War ended, Western powers find themselves in a dilemma of their own making. They may have won the ideological battle, but the hard-won peace, as Professor Andrew Bajovich claims in The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. Despite winning the Cold War, the United States has now ended up with gaping inequality, permanent war, moral confusion, and an increasingly angry and alienated population, as well as, of course, one of the most stranger presidents in American history, writing, of course, at the time of the Trump presidency. Francis Fukuyama, in The End of History, persuasively argued for the rise of Western liberalism and the dissolution of Soviet ideology. He suggested, of course, that humanity had reached a moral and economic pinnacle, not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological revolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. This book, of course, elaborating on his end of history thesis in 1989, where he means to synthesize the philosophies of Hegel and Marx as they envision human history on a progressive ladder from one economic system to another. This dialectic between egalitarianism versus totalitarianism. This is primarily suggesting that liberal democracy is the penultimate form of government, and all other alternative forms of government ultimately have failed as liberal democracy to prove itself. Liberal democracies, however, of course, are facing setbacks, and the United States' tension with global powers like Russia and China certainly make this evidently more clear. In Fukuyama's credit and favor, the world system as a whole is evolving towards democratic institutions that are liberal in nature. Liberal democracies have been able to better manage statecraft, governance, and economic development than other forms of social societal organization, as Fukuyama himself also argues. However, if that is indeed the case, then how do we explain the current morass, specifically the war in Ukraine at this moment being a prime example, where rising authoritarianism is back in vogue around the world, including in the part of Western democracies. Did history really come to an end, or was the news of liberalism perhaps over-exaggerated, as Fukuyama writes? Again, to dissect Fukuyama's essay and thesis, the suggestion is perhaps never made that the American style or Western style of liberal democracy would be a sine qua non of liberalism around the globe. And secondly, there isn't a single model of democracy, and that suggestion would be incorrect. Also, it may not be accurate to suggest that history always moves in a predictable, straightforward, linear manner, as Fukuyama will later go on to expound upon in responding to criticisms of his thesis. There may be retrenchment of liberal values from time to time, but the democratic project still go unabated as it moves forward. So if totalitarianism does make a comeback in different guises in newly emerging democracies, it will vigorously be challenged by the democratic and parliamentarian ideals and values in local and international settings. Robert Kagan, a conservative commentator here in the United States, poses the end of the Cold War leading into two broad assumptions about economic and ideological determinism, and this perhaps being the strongest critique of both Fukuyama's original thesis as well as his post notes. Firstly, U.S. foreign policy upheld an affirmation of belief in human progress rooted specifically in Enlightenment values and in the linear progression of history. And second, a belief in working with autocratic states with patience and restraint. Rather than confront and challenge autocracies, it was better to enmesh them in the global economy, support the rule of law and the creation of stronger state institutions, and let the ineluctable forces of human progress work their magic, Kagan states. And these beliefs have fueled the rise of Putin's Russia and Xi's China, for example, after the Cold War, as counterpoint to Western ideals of liberal democracy. While Reagan's principles standing against the common enemy may have contributed to the decline of the Civil War, the American presidents who came after the Cold War, both the Bushes, President Clinton and President Obama, have faced a power vacuum abroad and an inwardly looking America domestically. Thus, the working assumption outlined by the industry thesis as enunciated by Fukuyama and later outlined by Kagan have been significantly challenged, especially after 9/11, and when critics rightfully, with a line of argument, can still be applied to U.S. foreign policy today, criticizing Fukuyama and his followers for declaring a premature victory for liberalism and democracy, which then would arguably put the United States in a position of glorification, where we were able to then justify our military intervention in the name of liberalism and democracy around the world. To invoke Michael Mendelbaum once again, in his mission, to quote him once again, the calls for squandering of the peace dividend after a Cold War, which he called a mission failure of American foreign policy. Central to his argument is the claim that Americans after the Cold War simply fell too emboldened, again, reiterate that point, and failed to realize the limits of their own power. And I think this is at the crux of the primary critique of Fukuyama's thesis and of the argument for Western powers following the Cold War.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we have about 2 minutes left.
Sure, I'm just here to finish. Thank you. After 9/11, the war on terror overstretched American reach in trying to police the entire world. Furthermore, Fukuyama himself would go on to criticize neoconservatism and the arguable failures of Bush era foreign policy, though he didn't renege on his original thesis entirely. Not having a singular external enemy and a cohesive foreign policy vision, American power post-Cold War has been bereft in the world, perpetually on the move from one mission to another, not unlike a benevolent empire. While the neoliberal project of developing markets and trade and globalization has been ascendant, inequality and racial strife domestically has been increasing. Whereas George H.W. Bush's Gulf War established American supremacy and limits on constrained power, George W. Bush's Iraq War after 9/11 seemed untethered, especially when Americans entered the Iraq War on controversial evidence of WMDs and prematurely declared mission accomplished. Thus, contrary to the original scenario predicted by Fukuyama, which, while he did not completely back off his thesis, he would later criticize, history may have come back roaring with a vengeance, as alternatives to the American system of governance seem more attractive. And so to conclude, interventionism abroad, when coupled with the economic collapse and growing inequality due to the housing crisis and the COVID crisis here in the United States and in the West, has clearly brought the first American century line of argument to a major turning point, if not to a dead stop, despite the populist appeals to make America great again, as it were. While populists may be happy to align with the old Soviet foe, to beat out domestic and international enemies, it's not clear that Putin has any interest in advancing the American cause of freedom and democracy. In fact, the opposite obviously cannot be more true. If anything, Putin's Russia has come to fill in a gap left by the overstretched American presence in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine. Instead, Putin wants to rebuild the old Soviet empire inside NATO and Eastern Europe. This as well could not be more clear. And with the rising threats to China, as a complement to Putin's reconstituted Russia, America seems increasingly vulnerable now on the global stage, going it alone without its Cold War allies against a world hostile to unilateralism of American values. Another wave of populism at the ballot box may spell the end of American global power. 3 decades of cold peace squandered between isolationism and adventurism may have summoned the music history again. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all your presentations. And now the floor is open for the audience to ask questions. I think the gentleman in the blue shirt already started one, so go ahead.
Thank you for the flexibility also through the chair. So thank you for your presentation. I have like a few questions. The question for Lucas is, can you like go back, because like with the technical issue, the noise pollution and everything, it was like difficult like to get exactly our case like in like to get like your first point. So I would like to hear like more about like your first point, and that was like a brilliant presentation, I must say. To Emma, I was like intrigued by your focus like exclusively on the Soviet Union, and when I was like looking at your presentation, I was like thinking maybe there is a book by Ruth Ben-Jayed from New York University, who is like professor of history and Italian studies, if I remember correctly. She published like a strong man, and now she has a new blog I think on Mussolini, and also she make a linkage with the Putin, so that might be good. Also, like the other question that I have for you, Emma, is to because you talk about gender in terms of like women and everything, but if you focus on someone like Putin, there is like a strong anti-ethnicity sentiment. There is like an anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment. So I would like you to go like through this and just like clarify like probably gender, because gender is like more fluid and vast, I think. But it's in my humble opinion on that, and it's a question for you. And the question for my colleague from George Washington University. When, of course, like when you said like Fukuyama, immediately, for a historian, it's a bit difficult like to hear that, and I wanted to actually know exactly what would be your point after like you cited you quoted Fukuyama, you quoted like Kagan, you quoted like all of those neoconservative like between like quotation mark. And my point would be like our keynote speaker, Arne Westad, was pretty, I think, adamant like regarding like the risk of falling into this what he called like trap of like return of history. And I would like you to tell us like what you think in terms of like his position regarding that like history doesn't repeat itself, it doesn't come back, it doesn't like claim for vengeance, but it's there is new evolution, and of course like if history returns, we are all out of job. So that's really my question for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before you start answering the questions, I think we will give room for more. Okay? So, thank you. Yeah.
Sure. I had a question for Lucas. Since you were talking about recognition, and you said that I believe you said that the framing or recognition of this Russian Federation as like the core gave it the legal basis to be the successor state of the Soviet Union. And I wonder if you like believe that that's sufficient legal basis, especially in light of new challenges to that status. Like February, we see February this year. We're seeing that challenge in the UN that Russia will conserve its seat on the Security Council because it's not the Soviet Union. So I wonder how you feel about that personally.
Thank you. The lady behind.
Hi, thank you all of you for your presentations. And Lucas, your presentation was really interesting and I loved it, but I'll leave the question for people who know more about the Ukraine than I do. I have a question for Emma, actually, which is how you see gender and the performance of masculinity shaping politics and shaping particularly military institutions in Russia, and also how you think this gendered performance of masculinity by Putin is read by the rest of the world. I'm thinking also if you've read Frank Castigliola's article on CC pressure for penetration, which is about how Kennan reacted to Stalin and how the long telegram is filled with gendered and emotional language. If you think that that's related to Putin, and also if not, if you've read that article.
Marco?
Rather than a question, I would like to say a comment or an advice about Putin in gender, because if I understood correctly, you try to make the case of a continuity, let's say, in the gender regime between the Soviet Union and Russia. But have you thought about studying the differences? Because in my opinion, they're quite large. Let me just give you a couple of examples. When I was studying independent trade unions in the late Soviet Union, one of their claims was women should not perform the same job as men, should not. Because according to the Soviet gender agenda, you are a woman, you are not weaker than a man. So they can be a minor, for example, you can, and that's it. Or another example, when there are some parts of this Soviet gender mentality which are in Russia still to the present day. So, for example, when I travel to the Russian province, and I do that once in a while, I notice if I am a man, I just should not give my place on a bus to a woman. They don't do that because that implies that the woman is weaker. So if I'm a man, I should give the place. So when I noticed that I was the only one doing that, I stopped because I looked a sort of an idiot. So that's the example. And I was also told, don't do that because we do not do that.
Thank you very much. And one final question from the gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you very much. I also have a comment for both Emma and Lucas. So for Emma, maybe you followed what Alex has said. I mean, I agree with your paper, it's very intuitive, but I think what concerns me, especially in the context of increased Russophobia in the West, is just singling out Russia in particular. I think the word that I found more interesting by feminist historians is people who really show that across the traditions, you see very similar patterns of gender. So I'm thinking in particular John Scott as her work on sex and secularism and the veil. I mean, what's interesting it shows is that Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism are just the same. So really my invitation to you would be to, let's say, less exotify Russia. I'm also very unconvinced by this connection between the Soviet tradition and the contemporary tradition in a way similar to Marco, and rather try to show how actually Putin is perhaps more similar to the Western leaders that we might think of. And then my comment to Lucas maybe follows Abigail's comment, and it's also regarding UN membership. Because I think this would be a very interesting place for you to see also debates about sovereignty, not only in the 90s, but in the early Cold War when there was all this horse trading about UN membership. Because there was a point in which the Soviets wanted all of the republics to be UN members. And then the US said, okay, fine, we'll just have 50 states of the US as UN members. And there was a process of negotiation in which they made this happen, and at the end, only Ukraine and Belarus were original members of the UN. And that changes a little bit the picture than for you in the 90s. So it's like if you already have a seat on the table, that makes the situation different. Of course, it's not the end of the conversation. Serbia was very mistreated in that sense. The situation in Yugoslavia and Serbia was very different from the Soviets and the Russians. But I think that going to the UN might be helpful for you.
Thank you very much, and I would like to give the floor back to our presenters to respond to these questions, but in the meanwhile, feel free to collect some more questions.
Okay, yeah. I will start with a question Max posed. I'm not sure which first point you made, but I just try to, lay down, explicate the basis of my argument was its starting point. So I start with the term sovereignty, and what's interesting that sovereignty as a legal term was used in the Soviet federal system early on, so since 1922, and was reiterated through the different Soviet constitutions. And the sovereignty of the republics implied the right to secession, but obviously it was never meant to be fulfilled. So that's why I claim that the legal term sovereignty didn't have a fixed semantic meaning. So that made it attractive, for example, for the Baltic states. Lithuania used it already in public discourse 1988, because very different attentions could be assembled behind this term. So people who wanted to break away, or wanted more autonomy, or wanted to revolt against the Soviet elites could identify with the term sovereignty. And so that's one point. But it made it difficult, so the declaration of sovereignty, if sovereignty doesn't have a fixed semantic meaning, what does a declaration of sovereignty mean? And so my point was that at the beginning it probably, in most cases, meant more autonomy, but this meaning shifted towards independence, and different means were used to fixate or shift or to pursue this shift. Public discourse, official statements like declarations, and recognition. So that was like the conceptual relation between sovereignty and recognition. And to Abigail's question, I'm not an international lawyer, so it's difficult, but there were two main issues for the question of Soviet succession. And there was the nuclear issue and the debt issue. And both were settled quite early on, and all the other Soviet republics or former Soviet republics agreed on it. So the first settlement for the nuclear issue was the signing of START by Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine in 1992, and the debt issue was settled 1 year later. And I think that could provide the legal framework to justify the continued legal succession of Russia. But on the other hand, you have these treatments like the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, the Lisbon Protocol 1992, the NATO-Russia Founding Act 1997. So these were violated through the invasion. But I can't see the argument that this violation justifies the revocation of the succession or the successor status. And Daniel's comment, yeah, you're right. It's interesting. Ukraine had a peculiar status because of UN membership, though. So it didn't came from nothing to recognition. There was already kind of the role Ukraine and Belarus played on the international stage, although always perceived as part of the Soviet Union, right? But yeah, I have to look into it. Maybe I'll talk with you about it.
Thanks for everyone's questions. First, to address the criticisms, because I'm glad that those were brought up. I did not mean to single out Russia, but I did think it would be weird to submit a paper on the impact of Islam in North Africa for a Cold War conference. So I don't deny those. I don't deny that those connections are there, and that they are further than just Russia and Christianity, but just that they weren't within the scope of this paper. I think that kind of answers your point. Also on the equality of genders in Soviet Union and the anecdote you had, which was very, very enlightening. I agree in theory, however, I don't think that explains why the top positions were all held by men, and I think that reinforces the point. If it was an equality of genders within the system, then you would have seen more of a broader range of people in the top policy-making roles. The link between strongman theory and Putin was very well placed, thank you. And to your point, Max, about the relationship with the fluidity of gender, I agree that there's more that can be made there. However, in the context of Russia specifically, I think when you're talking about gender, we're still within a very traditional and orthodox framework. And when you're talking about the wider discussion, especially in the eyes of Putin, who doesn't recognize that there's a fluidity of gender, when he's building up his appearance and the way that he should be perceived, he's not taking that into account. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That would be my argument. That would be my argument back. And when it comes to the anti-ethnicity sentiment and the anti-LGBT sentiment, we also see gendered language when he talks about that. We see the discrediting of the LGBT movement as weak, as feminine, as the man who's gay is not the real man. We see that argument being put forward by the Kremlin.
That would be like, can I follow up on that?
Yeah, go.
Really briefly? But that's the point of like a politics that has been, you know, I'm not like a Russian field at all. I don't pretend that I'm an expert on that, but when you got like, when you survey like the entire history, you can take like any kind of like look about like what exactly Russia is, and you have like this opposition between, you have like always like even, I mean, Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and even like Russia, like current like Russia. They have like either a willingness like to embrace the West, depart from the West, criticize the West as like a sort of like a pure evil. And when you focus on Putin, Putin said clearly that like the West is weak. Multiple like discussions that he had like the even like laughing at journalists because like they were asking like question like democracy, freedom, multi-ethnicity, question of sex and gender and everything. But if you just like and all the in his view and even like in the view of like the church, the Orthodox Church, like everything that is like, you know, bad for Russia like comes from the West, and that's why we are like to separate a bit like from the West, like curiously. And so my question was really like, if in our like democratic society, liberal society, not autocracy, we give like more equality, like more like visibility, also like to our fellow LGBTQ plus community. You have like also like to take into consideration that even if Putin said, oh, you know, women are weak and everything, I want like to give like this kind of like projection of the image of powerful women. It's going to be the same thing for a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And in my view, but it's just my opinion as a citizen, of course, if you just like, you know, censor everything, kill people, put them like in and just like pretend that they are not existing, that doesn't mean that he is not like anti-LGBTQ plus, and that like the image that he projects goes like not just against women, against like other like population.
No, I agree with that, but I think that what I was trying to do in this presentation is to highlight the fact that in his mind, yes, he is going against a broader spectrum than just women, but the language that he's using is a very binary gendered language. And his approach towards that is very much in the binary. And when he goes against like the LGBTQ plus community, he's not going against them as, for example, if you're a gay man, he's not going against you as a gay man, he's going you as a feminine man. And discrediting, you know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense. So that would be that. So my argument isn't that he's not going against them because he is, but that he is using binary gendered language to do so. I think that's everything.
Right. Thank you very much. Then I don't think we have any room for more questions, unfortunately, because we have run out of time. So now we will have a short 5-10 minute break with coffee, and after that we'll